came out in hardback this week. I am so excited to be with you here live on the Barnes & Noble YouTube channel celebrating Children's Book Week 2020. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my books, my writing, and do a short reading, and then we're going to try and build the beginning of a fairy tale together. There's also going to be the chance for you to ask me some questions, so make sure you are adding your questions to the chat, and I'm going to answer some of those at the end. So thank you so much for joining in. This is so exciting for me. It's 8 o'clock in the evening here in London, and it's really exciting to be with you all. So my name is Anna James. I live in London, as I said. I am an almost full-time author, but all of my jobs have always been kind of booky related. I've been a school librarian and a books journalist, so I've always been really lucky to work with books and words, and that's kind of where the book series came from. It's a book about book wandering, and what that means is that you can travel inside of your favorite books and stories. My heroine is an 11-year-old girl called Matilda Pages, or Tilly for short, and when she realizes that she is a book wanderer, so kind of adventure ensues, and she goes down the rabbit hole with Alice. She meets Anne at Green Gable, and her best friend Oscar get embroiled in some mysterious goings on. So I'm going to test the interactivity of this setup straight away, because if anyone is watching live, I would love to know, if you realised that you were a book wanderer, where would you first travel to? And maybe I'll give you a moment to think about that, and I'm going to do a short reading. This is the first time that Tilly book wanders, and so whilst you're listening to this, have a think about where you would like to go if you could travel inside of any book you wanted, and pop it onto the chat, and I'd love to see where you'd like to go. So Alice, as in Alice in Wonderland, has just popped up in Pages & Co, which is the bookshop that Tilly lives in. Tilly stopped short. Alice? Yes, Alice said impatiently. It's very rude to forget someone so quickly after you first met them, you know. No, Tilly protested. I haven't forgotten you. I started to wonder if you were really, well, real. Why, it's even ruder to question if someone is real, Alice. Alice leaned across and pinched Tilly lightly on the arm. Ow, yelled Tilly. What did you do that for? To prove I'm real, obviously, Alice retorted. But it's impossible, Tilly said in frustration. I used to be very similar to you, Alice said, patting Tilly on the arm where she had just pinched her. But so many out-of-the-way things happened to me that I began to think that very few things are indeed really impossible. I know a woman who spoke a lot of nonsense most of the time, it has to be said. But she once told me that she sometimes believed as many as 6 impossible things a day, and all before breakfast. So nowadays I try to make a little more space for the impossible to happen. Alice attempted to give Tilly a moment to take in everything she'd said, but couldn't contain herself. Anyway, do you want to come to a tea party or not? You said yourself that you want to be more curious. Tilly looked up and steeled herself. Why not? How much stranger could things get? Alice bounced excitedly next to her and held out a hand. Tilly shrugged and took hold of it. All at once, Pages & Co seemed to divide into a grid of tiny tiles that click-clacked over each other, like a wooden toy folding down on itself. In only a few seconds, the whole shop had dominoed down and seemed to wind itself in under Tilly and Alice, as if pulled to them by a very powerful magnet. Tilly's stomach dropped like the moment you go over the top of a roller coaster, and there was a smell of marshmallows toasting on a bonfire. Instead of the familiar bookshop, Tilly and Alice were standing in a colourful forest, with a thatched house tucked into the trees and a long table set out in front of it. At one end of the table sat a large hare in a bow tie, a dormouse who seemed to be asleep, and a man wearing a rather mad-looking hat. Oh, you were talking about this tea party, Tilly said. So that's what happens when Tilly first book wanders and realizes that she can travel inside of her favorite books, and Alice in Wonderland is the first place that she goes. Now, I think maybe there were some responses that were flashing up on screen. So Tony said, To the Garden in the Secret Garden. That's an excellent choice, and I'm a big fan of The Secret Garden. And actually, if you read book 2, The Lost Fairy Tales, there might even be a little cameo from The Secret Garden, even though it's not a fairy tale. I think it might be the only non-fairy tale book that gets a shot in The Lost Fairy Tales. I had so much fun when I was writing this book, imagining where I would like to go to, and Tilly travels to Anne of Green Gables which is one of my all-time favorite books, and I loved trying to kind of recreate the voice of Anne. Jennifer said Sunset Towers from the Western Game. I have to admit that I've never heard of that. I do think there might be a little bit of a gap. Sometimes books that are popular in America aren't so popular here or aren't published here. Or of course, it might just be that I've never heard of it. There's lots and lots of books that I haven't read or haven't heard of. So I'm going to keep going, but do keep telling me where that you would like to book wander. I love hearing where people would like to book wander. I was very lucky last September to get to go on a tour of some schools in America for the first book coming out in hardback, and I loved hearing all the places that people wanted to go book wandering. Oh, Cheryl has said the Chronicles of Narnia, which is an excellent choice. I was thinking about rereading those books whilst we were all on lockdown. Right, we're gonna have a think about fairy tales. So the Lost Fairy Tales, I nearly said the wrong title. So in the UK, the books have a slightly different title. They're called Tilly and so Tilly and the Bookwanderers, Tilly and the Lost Fairy Tales, and I sometimes get slightly muddled, so you'll excuse me if I get it wrong. But in book 2, The Lost Fairy Tales. Oh, and I've just seen that Sophia said she travelled to Pages & Co., which is a lovely answer, also a very clever answer, because of course, if you went to Pages & Co., you could then book wander to all the other places within that, from that book. So that's a very smart answer. In The Lost Fairy Tales, Tilly and Oscar go to Paris for the Christmas holidays, and they stay with Oscar's dad, who lives there, and they get involved in a book of fairy tales. And the thing about fairy tales is that because they don't just have one author, they are much more dangerous to book wander into. I'm sure you know fairy tales have lots of different versions, and that makes them more unpredictable. But when they travel inside of this book of fairy tales, they realize things are even more sort of awry than they should be. There are characters getting lost, characters ending up in the wrong fairy tales, villains on the loose, and there's book magic leaking out everywhere. And they have to work out how they can help fix the fairy tales. Fairy tales were such a fun thing to get to play with. There are so many different kinds of fairy tales and different characters, and playing with them and what they would really be like was one of the things I had the most fun with. For example, they bump into Prince Charming, who is not quite as charming as they expected. I am hoping that we are going to be able to put together a fairy tale together, thinking about the sorts of things that you would expect to find in a fairy tale. Although, if you want to go completely sort of off-piste and pick your own things, the great thing about, of course, writing your own stories is that you can do whatever you would like. So I have written the first few sentences of a kind of stereotypical fairy tale. And what I would like you to do is to help fill in the blanks. So I need you, maybe I should have said this at the start, I need you to grab a piece of paper and a pen, or if you have a phone, you could type it in, or again, if you're watching this on a computer, you could maybe type it into a note on the side, but grab something that you can write down words. You're going to need space for about 11 words. So I'm going to show you the first sentence to show you what I mean. So here you go. It says, once upon a time there was a blank called blank. So I put numbers 1 and it's difficult to do this, 1 and 2. And what we're going to do is we're going to fill in all of our different words until we build a fairy tale all together. Now, usually I do this in real life with real people, and I can hear what people are saying. So we're going to have a go at doing it remotely, and I'm going to rely on you writing it down at home. But if you would like to share what you are filling the blanks in with, that would be brilliant. And please do type in some of your suggestions in the chat, and we can have a go at building our own fairy tales. So to start with, whilst you're grabbing something to write with, I want you to just have a think about fairy tales and the sort of characters and people and objects that you might find in fairy tales. But as I said, you can do a traditional fairy tale, or you can do something completely different. When I do this in schools, sometimes we write really silly, weird fairy tales. Sometimes we have sci-fi fairy tales, and sometimes we have very kind of classic fairy tales. So what you want to do with this structure is completely up to you. And once we've got our answers written down, I'm going to have to rely on the fact that you've got your answers. I'm going to read them out with the blanks, and I want you to be at home and shout your answers out so that we have a whole fairy tale beginning. And then once you have your beginning filled in, you can take this idea and you can write the rest of it if you would like to. And I hope that you kind of feel inspired by your ideas, because the wonderful thing about writing stories is that you can write about whatever you are interested in. And when I get asked for writing advice, the thing I always say is write something that you would love to read. So there's no right or wrong answers. Okay, so I'll hold this one up again. Okay, so once upon a time, there was a blank called blank. So next to number one, write number one on your piece of paper. And next to it, you need to write what sort of being or animal or person is your fairy tale going to be about. And then for number two, you can give them a name. So for number one, it could be a prince or a princess. It could be an animal, a horse, a bear, a unicorn. It could be a witch or a wizard or anything that you want. It can be a fairy tale creature, or it can be something completely different. And then you need to give them a name. So once upon a time, there was a blank called blank. Oh, I'm seeing some responses already. So once upon a time, there was a cat called Misty. Oh, I like that one a lot. A cat called Misty, a kind of witchy fairy tale. I like that one a lot. So make sure you're writing your answers down, corresponding with the numbers, and do share on the chat if you would like to. Okay, so I'm a young girl called Elizabeth. I like that one. That feels like a very kind of classic fairy tale. I like that one a lot. Okay, so moving on to the next sentence, which is, all they wanted was blank. So in fairy tales, and in fact in all stories, your character has to want something, and whether they have it and how they find it or how they don't find it is what a lot of stories are about. And in fairy tales, this tends to be something that is kind of particularly sort of literal. They're often looking for a person or a thing. So for your next one, for number three, what does your character want? Now, this can be an object. It could be a person. It could be even something they want to get better at. You know, they want to, all they wanted was to be brave or something like that. It is completely up to you. So which way around is it? This way? What was that? I'm not sure which way around makes sense for you watching, but let's do them on top of each other, then they make sense. Here we go. Once upon a time, there was a blank called blank, and all they wanted was blank. So write down your answers, and if you'd like to share with me, okay, we've got a frog. Once upon a time, there was a frog called Jimmy. I like that one very much. And so Adam has said that one. And then, so Adam, what does Jimmy the frog want in your fairy tale? Okay, so moving on to, so I was going to call it slide number 3, but this is a low-tech version of a PowerPoint presentation. So next it says their greatest strength was blank, but their greatest weakness was blank. So again, a lot of these things apply to all stories, not just fairy tales, because your characters have to have strengths and weaknesses. They have to have things they're good at. We're just like people. We have things that we're good at that help us, and we have things that we're maybe not so good at. Now, these could be practical skills that they are good or bad at. Things like in fairy tales, they could be good or bad at magic or horse riding or things like that. But this could also be to do with personality traits. So it could be things that their greatest strength, that they were very kind, but their greatest weakness was that they weren't very brave, something like that. So a glimpse of a unicorn. I love that one. I'm assuming that is all they wanted was a glimpse of a unicorn. I love that. That's a brilliant idea. And try and tie, when we're getting further through the fairy tale, have a think about the things that we're writing, how they factor into your story. So if your character, all they want is a glimpse of a unicorn, think about how their strengths and their weaknesses might help or get in the way of them finding the glimpse of the unicorn. So, you know, if someone, all they wanted was a glimpse of a unicorn, their greatest weakness might be that they are really noisy, and so they scare all the unicorns away, for example. Okay, so moving on. Well, actually, let's test how this is working. So I'm going to read it out. I'm not going to say blank or the number. I'm just going to hold it. I'm going to leave a gap. And then when you are sitting at home, I want you to shout out what you have written here, okay? I have no way of knowing if this is going to work, but I have faith in you. So, once upon a time, there was a called, and all they wanted was, their greatest strength was, but their greatest weakness was. Okay, so that's the first half of our fairy tale. Oh, someone suggested jumping. I'm assuming that's a strength, but it could be a weakness. And it said swimming as well. So I don't know which way around they are, but either way works. Okay, so next, a classic fairy tale trope. So they went to ask the advice of a blank called blank who lived in blank. So I've got a few things to think of. So often, of course, in fairy tales, our heroes or heroines, they go and ask the advice of somebody who might be able to help. Now, this could be a witch or a wizard. It could be a fairy. It could be a magical animal. It could be anything that you want. So think about what sort of being it is, and what their name is, and then have a think about where they might live. So this could be a magical place. It could be under a toadstool. It could be in a creepy cave. It could be in a tree house. It could be absolutely anywhere that you want. So have a think about these. I hope that you can see this okay. And my handwriting is neat enough for you to be able to read this. There you go. So who do they go and ask advice from, and where do they live? Okay, so that's 6, 7, and 8. So that's the next thing to think about. What happens next is they gave them a magic blank that would blank. So again, a kind of classic fairy tale trope is that this being they go and seek help from gives them a magical something. So it could be a magical lamp or a magical book or a magical anything. So your job is to think about what magical item you are going to give them and what does it do. So number 10 is what it would do. And actually I'm going to do number 11 at the same time. This is all part of the same sentence, but I couldn't fit it on one piece of paper. So because the next part is, but warned them that if used incorrectly, it would blank. So this is all kind of, let me hold it like this. This is all kind of one sentence. So they gave them a magic blank that would blank, but warned them that if used incorrectly, it would blank. So what is the magical object supposed to do, but what might happen if it was used incorrectly? So I hope that you have some ideas for the beginning of our fairy tale. I'm going to recap quickly, and then we're going to attempt again to read it all the way through. And if you're watching at home, you can shout out what you've written down for each space. And again, if you are doing this along at home, I would love to know what you are filling in the blanks with. So do type it into the comments. And also, remember that you can ask me questions about Pages & Co. and being a writer as well. So don't forget to type in your questions that we're going to come to in a moment. So this is the recap, first of all. Okay, so once upon a time, there was a blank, number 1, called blank, number 2. All they wanted was blank. Their greatest strength was blank, but their greatest weakness was blank. So they went to ask the advice of a blank called blank who lived in blank. Oh no, I'm the wrong way around. They gave him a magical blank that would blank, but warned them that if used incorrectly, it would blank. Okay, so I'm going to give you a second. I'm going to give myself a second to put the pieces of paper back in the right order. And I'm going to give you a second to make sure that you have got all of your suggestions for a fairy tale written down, ready to do a kind of read along all together. So, okay, are we ready? I'm going to read it out, leave spaces, and you can call out at home for what you decided to put in the blanks. So, right, here we go. Okay, wish me luck to not drop all the pieces of paper. So, once upon a time, there was a called. All they wanted was Their greatest strength was, but their greatest weakness was. So they went to ask the advice of a called who lived in. They gave them a magical that would, but warned them that if used incorrectly, it would. Oh, we've got a suggestion from, I think this is Sophie again, if I remember the name from the first one. A magical door handle that would grant her wishes, but if not used correctly, she would disappear forever. That is a brilliant suggestion, Sophie. I would read a story about that. If you want to share what you've put into your fairy tales, then do type into comments. But equally, you can find me all over the internet. I am a case for books on Twitter. And on Instagram. And if you want to share your fairy tale opening with me, I would love to read it on there. And of course, what happens next is up to you. So if you've got a beginning of a fairy tale that you feel inspired by, then you can see what happens next. And I would love to know what you have chosen to write your fairy tale about. And if you would like to know how I kind of played with fairy tales and what I decided, you can read The Lost Fairy Tales, which is the second book in the Pages & Co series. Now, we have got some time for questions. Now, I'm hoping they're going to magically appear on the screen for me to answer. So please do pop your questions into the chat and I will answer as many as I can. And whilst I am waiting for some of them, I wonder actually if I'm going to go a little bit out of order, but maybe just talk about some of my book recommendations, because I know that everyone's been really enjoying sharing book recommendations whilst we've all been on lockdown and quarantine and reading lots. So I have found that I have been reading a lot of my old favorites, and these aren't that old, but two of my favorites. And actually I should say as well, obviously I'm in London, so some of these book covers, you might recognize the titles, but I might have slightly different book covers to you because I'm in London. So two of my favorite children's books from kind of the last 10 years are Rooftopers by Catherine Rundell, and I know that this is definitely a different cover in America. This is a brilliant book about children who run across the rooftops of Paris. And another of my favorite books that I have been going back to is When You Reach Me by Rebecca Stead. Rebecca Stead is one of my favorite children's writers, and I think I've read all of her books so far, and I hope that there's a new one coming soon. Another book I have been going back to. Oh, I'm going to pause because we've got a question. So it says, how do you decide which stories to have Tilly book wander into? So this is a mix of reasons. So there's a very tedious reason that I won't spend too long talking about, which is all to do with copyright, which means some books that are older, you're allowed to kind of borrow ideas from without having to ask the author, whereas newer books, you have to ask people's permission. So to keep things nice and simple, I have used all books that are old enough that you are allowed to kind of borrow the characters yourself. It's a mix of books that I love reading and books that I thought would be really interesting to book wander into. So Anne of Green Gables is there because it's just one of my all-time favourite books. And actually a lot of the book came about by imagining what it would be like to talk to Anne Shirley. And then Alice in Wonderland I really enjoyed as well, but I just thought so many people would love to book wander to Alice in Wonderland. I think that would be high up a lot of people's book wandering wish lists. And it's also got such iconic kind of wild characters and settings that it worked really well for the book. So it's a mix of books that I love and I want to think about what it would be like to book wander, and books that kind of work for the story. Rachel, who is 11, has said, is Pages & Co going to be a trilogy? And it is, yes. So book 3, which is called The Map of Stories, which is that title's just been announced, is coming out in September in America and here in the UK. So it's the first book that's coming out at the same time, which is exciting for me. So not behind, which is lovely. So it's, yes, The Map of Stories, and it's the third book. And I don't want to give anything away, but I will say that if you've read the second book, it ends on a little bit of a cliffhanger, which, sorry, but book 3 kind of pretty quickly picks up on what happens. So if you found that cliffhanger a little bit frustrating, I'm sorry, but I promise that you will be straight back into it when it gets to book 3. So yes, there will be another book, which is exciting for me. Jack, who is 8, says, what gave you the idea to write a book about going into other books? Honestly, I just think that if I could do any kind of magic, if I could have a magical power, it would be to travel into books. It would be to book wonder. Books mean so much to me, and when I was growing up, books meant an awful lot to me, and the ability to talk to the characters, I think it's particularly that, even though getting to travel into all these magical lands would be amazing, for me the real appeal is getting to talk to the characters that meant a lot to me growing up, like Anne Shirley, and there's a little bit to do with the Little Princess in book one as well. And I think that those characters that really helped shape me as a reader and a writer and as a person, being able to talk to them is the real kind of the real thing that's exciting for me. And also just I love the idea of kind of making the way that we talk about books, you talk about getting lost in a good book and, losing track of time and sort of all the kind of language around reading and how magical it is. The idea of like each book being a portal into another world, which it is. And I kind of love the idea of just pushing that language kind of one step further and thinking, what would a world look like where you could literally get lost in a good book, which I know is something that a lot of writers kind of find like a fascinating thing. I think to be a reader or a writer is to kind of wonder a bit about what it would be like to travel inside of books. Sophie says, if you could book wander into any book that isn't your book, in your books, what would it be? I have to be honest that I am not sure if I am brave enough to book wander into some of my favorite books. Some of my all-time favorite books are a series called His Dark Materials. The first book is called, it's called Northern Lights here, but I believe it's called The Golden Compass in America. And I love those books, but I think it would just be really scary to book wander into. So I'm going to stick with just reading those at home. I have used a lot of the books that I would like to book wander into in my book, but actually, do you know, another book that I'd love to book wander into is was going to be my third reading recommendation, and that is The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton. This is one of my favorite books. I love it, and I think that kind of the portal into another world definitely had an impact on me writing book wandering. And this is a little bit of a spoiler, but there is a character, I think I can say this, there's a character in book 3 that is named after a character in The Phantom Tollbooth. So you look out first. So the Phantom, that's probably where I would go first if I was going to book wander into somewhere that I haven't used in the Pages & Co series. Ali, who is 8, what is the process for editing books? Oh, this is a good question. So I write a first version. I write my first drafts from beginning to end, and I don't read them back. So I open a Word document and I write straight through, and then I sort of sit back and think about what I've got, and then I have an editor. I'm very lucky to have 2 brilliant editors. So I have a sort of main editor in London who takes the sort of first look at everything and helps me get everything into the right place. But my editor in America also helps me kind of shape it and suggests ideas as well. And then I kind of take all their ideas and I sort of shape it, move things around. And then actually one of my favorite stages of editing is once we've done all the kind of plot stuff and getting all the bits in the right place, is I kind of read the book all the way through again and really try and make the sentences as good as they can be, which I'm sure is something you know from writing stories at school. When your teachers tell you that you need to edit a book, then I'm afraid that they are right. And it's a good thing to remember that none of the books that you read and that you love, none of them are straight out of an author's head. All authors edit their work and work at it really hard to try and make it as good as it can be. Thank you. That's an interesting question. I quite like editing. I'm very lucky that I've worked with very kind and clever editors. Adam has said, do you listen to music while you write? And if so, what do you listen to? I do listen to music while I write, although I can't listen to music that has words in it. I find it a bit confusing having songs with words in at the same time as I'm trying to write my words. But I listen to film soundtracks, to film scores when I write, and I have different playlists for different emotions. So I have I listen to like action film when I'm trying to write adventurous bits, and I listen to kind of sort of sad film soundtracks when I'm writing more emotional bits. One that this isn't a film really, this is a play, so I don't know if anyone's had the chance to see Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, which is on in London but also is on in Broadway, obviously, when theatres are open. And that play has a beautiful score written by Imogen Heap, and I listen to that a lot while I'm writing Pages and Co. And I think we might have time for one more before we wrap up. I guess so. Cadence, what a lovely name. Aged 10 says, how many drafts do you usually write? Usually it's 4 or 5, I think, is probably. There's sort of 3 drafts that are kind of changing things around and moving the plot around, and then 1 or 2 drafts where I'm kind of working on the language and developing things in a more like zoomed in way. And then we have something that we call a copy edit afterwards, where someone new with fresh eyes reads it through and make sure that I haven't put too many hours in one day, or I've said that it's raining in one chapter and then it's not raining immediately afterwards, and checks for things like that might have slipped through the net. But yeah, so 4 to 5 plus a copy edit. A lot of drafts. It takes. I hadn't realized how long it took to write a book before I started writing books. Right, I think that is all that we have got time for. Thank you so much for everyone who has watched and asked questions. Pages and Co, both books, The Book Wanderers and The Lost Fairy Tales, are available 24/7 from Barnes & Noble online. So do be sure to check them out there. And make sure that you follow the hashtag. I'm going to check I've got the hashtag right. The hashtag is #BookWeek2020 at home. So if you have a look at that, then you can find all sorts of other kind of bookish videos and things to do. And you can find me at Case for Books on Twitter if you want to say hi or share your fairy tales with me. Thank you again for watching, and I hope that you have a lovely weekend.